Welcome to the Spotlight. I'm your host, Behruz Najaf. We will be discussing China-U.S. issue over Taiwan today. Let me introduce our guests in this edition. We'll have Emeritus Professor at the University of Wisconsin, Frank Emsbeck from Madison. And also author with ANTICONQUISTA, Nicholas Ayala, joining us out of Newark. Okay, now let me just welcome our guests to the show, both, and let's go to Frank in Madison. Now, Frank, there are some people are arguing that Washington's confirmation that U.S. Marines training Taiwanese forces for more than a year could undermine moves toward détente between Washington and Beijing. Do you share the same view?
Well, certainly. I mean, first of all, it was done in secret. And so at the one hand, you're saying you want to have good relations and criticizing the Chinese for flying planes too close to Taiwan. On the other hand, you've got a secret military operation going on. So obviously, it's a problem.
Now, Nicholas, let us know your opinion on that.
I agree entirely. I mean, if détente is still defined as wanting to ease relations between hostile nations, then of course this is going to do the exact opposite. The Taiwanese government is one that seeks to claim territory, claim sovereignty over all of mainland China, which is absolutely ridiculous, and has been a point of tension for decades between U.S. and Chinese relationships and their history. So I think this move by the U.S. military is clearly an undermining of Chinese interests and Chinese wishes, as well as previous agreements that the U.S. and China have agreed upon to essentially not recognize the sovereignty of the Taiwanese government.
Now, Frank, the U.S. is aware of how sensitive the Taiwan issue is for China. So what do you think is behind Washington's provocations in Taiwan?
Well, I'm not sure what's behind it. There has been, since 1949, since the Civil War in China, a very, very strong lobby, initially in the 50s and 60s, who lost China, like it's ours to lose, but consistent for many, many years now, basically never really wanting to recognize the sovereignty of the Chinese government. And China, of course, has been very clear that there's going to be a one China policy, and that's the only thing they're willing to accept. Now, we agreed to do that, which is why we have the current arrangements we do. But clearly, there is unrest within the administration over that. And the Taiwanese issue may be a good way to show that the Biden administration is really strong and a strong military, and can stand up to threats and so forth. Because I think he's looking for various ways to mobilize people behind the administration that are not going to be mobilized because of the economic issues that he's pushing.
Now, Nicholas, in reaction to the U.S. troop deployment in Taiwan, China has said that it will take all necessary steps to protect its sovereignty and territorial integrity. So what message is Beijing sending to the U.S., NATO, and Taiwan?
Well, Beijing's sending a hardline message, and it usually sends these messages of, look, we have this policy, we've all agreed upon this policy, that is the one China policy, and it's in everyone's interest, because I would also argue it's in the interest of the U.S. economically, who's become so economically interconnected to the Chinese economy. It's in the world's interest to not heighten tensions between the U.S. and China, between two of the largest global economic powers in the world, and not to rush into any sort of irrational decisions that could lead to hostile acts. And China is really trying to remind, I would say, the world that there are agreements that were set where the international world kind of came together and concurred, and those agreements are not being met right now. They're being undermined, and China's not going to stand for that. It's gotten to a point where China can now actually assert itself on the international world because of its growth economically, politically, and militarily. So it's going to use that newfound strength to really push its own interest against the interest of NATO and the U.S.
Frank, the U.S. and Taiwan are believed to be exaggerating this Chinese military flights in that area. Taipei claims that it's Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ. You know, it's not a country's airspace. And the Chinese warplanes typically pass through the southwestern corner of that area, far from Taiwan. So what's the reason for this hype?
I think to make the point that the prior speaker made, that the Chinese intend to assert themselves. You know, you're looking at Taiwan, but you might want to look at South America, because what's happening there is the Chinese are making huge investments in an area that's been traditionally controlled by the United States. Then if we're talking about challenges, that's an example of the Chinese growth economically and politically. And I suspect that there is more and more interest in this in Washington than meets the eye. But the fact of the matter is that China is the #2 economic power today. There's every expectation that it'll go back to where it was in the 17th century, that is the #1 economic power and the #1 technological power. And, you know, the United States is having trouble understanding that and accepting that. So I think all of that is also within this context of we may no longer be #1 and maybe #2, and it's very, very hard for any administration or the population here to accept that idea.
Nicholas, on Tuesday we had U.S. President Biden telling reporters that he and President Xi Jinping have agreed to stick with the Taiwan agreement. Well, this has many wonder if Washington and Beijing have reached an agreement on Taiwan's political status. What's your assessment?
Well, it's interesting when you read the reports about that meeting. As you said, Biden agreed with Xi Jinping to continue to follow the Taiwan agreement. But at the same time, after he made that statement, Taiwan officials reached out to Biden asking for clarification on what he meant, and the U.S. responded saying that relationships between the U.S. and Taiwan will continue as they've always have been. So in other words, what the U.S. is doing and what the U.S. has historically done is it speaks out of both sides of its mouth. It's going to reassure China that they're going to continue their policies because the U.S. doesn't want any serious conflict with China because it can't afford to. And at the same time, it's going to reassure Taiwan that, look, we're going to continue our relationship that we've historically had with you, and kind of sort of subtly undermining the Taiwan agreement. Now, the U.S. does that because the U.S. sees Taiwan as a strategically located in a position where they can assert their own dominance to counter Chinese dominance. And that's really what we're seeing when the U.S. speaks out of both sides of its mouth. It tries to reassure Xi Jinping while simultaneously trying to reassure the Taiwanese.
Now, Frank, there are some analysts who expect a spiral of military tension in the region, given the circumstance that many consider to be the crux of Beijing's One China principle. Do you expect a war?
Well, I don't expect it, and I certainly hope that there won't be one, because then we're not going to have to worry about climate change or anything else. The fact of the matter is, it's not in our interest to have a war, in the United States' interest or the Chinese, over Taiwan or over anything else, because you've got humanity at stake here. And I think that the parties understand that. The danger here is that you could begin to do things that escalate and that go beyond somebody's control. Or you could have the election of a leader in some country, say this one, that is irrational. And so all these rational ideas don't make any sense. I think that the danger here is that there is no vision, at least I don't see a vision here in the United States, that says we need to reset our relationship and figure out how we can actually have a progressive, positive, open relationship with China. What would that look like? Would it be the same thing as building submarines, or maybe we're going to build something else like that we can mutually trade? And I don't hear that vision. I don't hear that speaking. I don't hear that coming from the administration or any significant sector of the people who make foreign policy in this country. And that is extremely concerning to me.
Now, Nicholas, we have the Taiwanese defense minister who's saying that this recent Chinese warplane drills has put the military tensions across the Taiwan Strait at their most serious level of more than 4 decades. And then he predicted that China could attack Taiwan within the next 4 years. Would China do that?
Well, as previously stated, I think, attacking Taiwan would be irrational on China's part. There's no reason for China to attack a territory that they already claim to have domain over. There's no reason for them to risk their economic, military, and political power, which is on the rise, trying to go to war with the Western countries over Taiwan. It would just be absolutely irrational for the Chinese to launch some sort of invasion against Taiwan. But the Taiwanese defense minister is saying all of this because it is in the Taiwanese interest to push this propaganda of a potential war looming on the horizon, a potential Chinese invasion, because that's really what gets spread in the U.S. Media and told to the U.S. The population in order to justify continuous military actions with Taiwan or in the South China Sea in order to defend Taiwanese interests, which really don't need to be defended.
Frank, what about in case Taipei announces independence from China?
Well, that's a whole nother question, and I don't know. I think the Chinese would probably feel pretty upset about that. Then the question is, who would recognize the independence? So Taiwan can say anything it wants, but if Japan and the United States and the other major powers continue to uphold the China agreement and don't recognize Taiwan, then I don't suppose much will happen. But obviously, if they declared independence and gave up the aspiration of reconquering China, which of course is completely nuts, and then somebody of significance recognized them, that would be a major shift in the wrong direction, I suspect, and certainly ratchet up tensions and bring about maybe the possibility of an armed confrontation. Although since everybody knows this is what would happen, it's not, I'm hopeful that rationality will prevail here, particularly amongst the Western powers, so-called. Taiwan will not declare independence, I suspect, unless they have already an agreement with somebody of significance to recognize them. What would be the point?
Nicholas, let's hear your opinion.
No, I mean, I agree entirely. It would make no sense, even from a Taiwan perspective, to declare independence without recognition. And this is sort of the struggle that we're seeing play out right now. And we've seen that through the struggle that most countries are unwilling to really recognize Taiwan as a nation state, because that would cause serious conflict and serious issues with the PRC government, which is significantly stronger, has a significantly larger role and impact in the global economy, and is far more invested in the international community's interests, both economically, politically, and militarily. So it really doesn't make much sense for Taiwan even to declare independence and sort of push without having the other major nations support them. They would simply be pushing the whole world into a serious conflict, into serious potential armed conflict.
Frank, the State Department has asserted the U.S. commitment to Taiwan as rock solid. Now the question is, why should there be such a strong commitment and even legislation in the United States to give such a staunch support to another country?
Well, this is from the Civil War in the 1940s. You know, the question was posed in this country, and it was a source of McCarthy's support. Senator McCarthy went after people saying, who lost China? This was a big thing, that there were people in the State Department who conspired with the communists in China to lose China. In other words, for Chiang Kai-shek, who was the dictator and thrown out, to lose. And there was this very, very large lobby of conservative Republicans primarily, but also some Democrats, who for years persisted in this who lost China business. President Nixon, when he lost the first time to Kennedy by just a sliver, his campaign was defending Quemoy and Matsu, you know, these two islands off Taiwan, you know, within shouting distance to China. So this issue of China has been a part of American foreign policy for years, part of the justification for the war in Vietnam. was China, that they were an aggressor, that really North Vietnam was a tool of China. Not true, obviously, but still, that's part of the popular culture. That's part of a deep, deep strain in the Republican Party. The Cheneys, in spite of what problems he's having now, the Cheney faction of the Republican Party believe this. So, you know, you cannot separate this long-standing anti-communist aspect of American foreign policy, particularly in regards to China, from what's happening today. And again, from Biden or other people saying, maybe we can use this to bolster our credentials as being tough. I mean, we had a rough time in Afghanistan, but now we can stand up and show we're tough in the way that the Pentagon likes, with bombers and ships and whatnot.
Right. Nicholas, China is also opposed to the AUKUS deal by the U.S., the UK, and Australia, as you know. So where do Australia and the UK stand in this U.S.-China dispute?
Well, seemingly from the AUKUS deal, Australia and the UK are right alongside with the United States. And it's interesting, you know, the deal which involves the nuclear-powered submarines essentially is coming out of these three nations who are very interested in the strategic region of the South China Sea. And it's very clear that this is what the deal is all about, even though there's no mention of China and even though there's no mention of any particular regions. It's obvious that given the previous very recent events that have unfolded with crises in the South China Sea, with multiple nations claiming ownership of certain islands and certain resources, it's clear that the U.S., Australia, and the UK are working together to have some sort of influence in this region. They see that there are, you know, large reserves of oil, natural gas in the area, and they want to really reinforce and like I said earlier, assert their dominance in the region. And this is all being coupled with, as again mentioned before, the rise of China. So China's being able to extend their own influence throughout the Pacific, and this is becoming a threat because the Pacific is one of the most important international trade avenues or trade routes for many nations, especially in the United States and especially Australia. So they need to be able to have their own trade routes protected, have their own hegemony protected. And this is really what the deal is showing. The deal is showing that the U.S., UK, and Australia are on one side, and they're putting China and potentially many other allies like Russia and Iran on the other side.
Okay. Frank, we only have 30-40 seconds. Tell us about the UK in this. We had a British ship also sailing in disputed waters near China recently.
Say that again, please.
Tell us about the UK and where the UK stands in this.
Well, you know, the UK, you mean Great Britain? Or maybe mini Britain, they're still back with you know, taking Hong Kong and the wars in 1825. They haven't quite got the picture yet, Boris Johnson in particular. So, you know, they want to be a partner, and they're basically a very, very junior partner, more like a lapdog than a partner. But that's what they're after, and the conservative government has been very clear that they want to be considered as a leader here. And I mean, from a practical point of view, it's nonsense. From a political point of view, they're trying to distinguish themselves a bit from the European Union. But I think overall, the question really is the United States going to reassess what it's doing? Are there forces here that are going to say, going down the road of confrontation, of economic warfare, is not in our interests as a nation or as a world? And are they strong enough, or they will be strong enough, to do something about it? Okay. Because if not, and we have this continuing tension, sooner or later, something disastrous will happen.
Okay, that's all the time we have for this episode. So let me thank our guest, Emeritus Professor with the University of Wisconsin, Frank Emsbeck from Madison, and author of the ANTICONQUISTA, Nicholas Ayala in Newark. And thank you for watching this edition of The Spotlight. I've been your host, Behruz Najafin. I'll see you next time.